Time for our afternoon session, and I'm pleased to introduce to you Jennifer Howe, who's professor at Andover Newton, which is now part of Yale Divinity School, and she will give the Christian perspective on our theme of religious identity, dividing or creating.
Thank you so much, Doug. And thank you so much to Sylvia and Dick Kaufman for this incredible opportunity, for this venue and this forum to have these rich conversations. And thank you to Grand Valley State University for hosting us here. It is not an overstatement to say I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. And that's partly because Doug is such a planner that I think he asked me a year and a half ago to do this talk. So, but what that has allowed me to do is to really slowly simmer over this question for a long time. And I find that's very generative to my own thinking. And it's just been such a treat to be working with Ibu and Elliot and thinking with them and talking with them just this yesterday and now today. So I've decided to divide my comments into 4 sections. I'm one of those people who loves to have a roadmap at the beginning of any journey. I really miss those little AAA flip books that you remember those? Like, I do love a good Google map, but something about that with the little highlighted line they would draw for you, I just felt so taken care of somehow. So my version of that is to tell you what the 4 parts of my talk are going to, how I will frame those. The first one is I'm going to talk a little bit about our key question and some ways that I want to slightly reframe the question. Secondly, I'm going to talk about some ways, some dynamics that are very old in this process of constructing we and other as a foundation to move into a conversation in part 3 of my talk about a new sort of typology of responses to sameness and difference that really was sparked in my own thinking as I ruminated about this question over the last year and a half. And then finally, the part 4 is called The Call to Love as We Have Been Loved, which will dig a little more deeply into my own Christian resources and sense of calling to do this interreligious work. So reframing the question, part 1. Religious identity, dividing or uniting. This is our theme. More expansively, the question we set ourselves is, do our religious communities contribute to division and tribalism in today's society? Or do we have the resources in our traditions and texts to unite around a shared commitment to the common good? Last night at our Q&A session, someone boldly asked us to put numbers on that question, like 50-50, what are we talking about? And I think, it's a very timely and pressing question. And part of the way I want to take it seriously is actually by interrogating the question a little bit. On one level, the simplest answer to this is yes, right? Yes, our religious communities have, and in my case, Christianity has, contributed to division and tribalism. And yes, we have the resources within our traditions to unite around a shared commitment to the common good. I imagine everyone in here could cite teachings, traditions, texts that would add to the balance of that equation on one side and the other. But as I sat down to prepare this talk, something was bothering me. I was really having trouble getting going. Something about an assumption behind that question was not sitting well with me. And now I helped frame the question in conversation with all of these fine folks. So hear this as much as a self-critique as anything else. But I think there was something in the question that might actually be part of the problem, a certain dichotomy. At the very least, it is a leading question. On the one hand, we have the regrettable tendency towards tribalism and division. And on the other hand, we have the enlightened quest for unity and the common good. There are strong clues in the word choice and sentence structure about the right answer, right? The not so subtle implication is that division and tribalism are bad and must be forsaken in favor of a commitment to unity and the common good, which are obviously good, right? But I want to argue that both divisions, which I would like to reframe and think about as differences, and unity, which I'd like to reframe and think about as similarities or sameness, exist simultaneously and must be mutually safeguarded. In fact, I would argue that both our impulses towards division and our impulses towards unity have their own positive and negative dimensions. Both are capable of contributing to a healthy civic life, and both can become barriers to that same goal. So let's start with tribalism. Tribalism, as it's most commonly used these days, has a real pejorative connotation, referring to a kind of single-minded allegiance to one's own group, coupled with a lack of care or concern for anyone outside of one's group. For example, in the October 2018 issue of the Atlantic Monthly, there's an article called "The Threat of Tribalism," part of a cheerful series called "Is Democracy Dying?" But having been born in South Africa, I actually hear a trace in this pejorative definition of tribalism of a kind of historical irony, because animosity among tribes in South Africa were consciously stoked as part of a systematic strategy by two invading tribes, the Dutch and the British, in order to maintain their own power. So if we can resist the pejorative connotation and just think of a more neutral definition of tribalism as a system of organizing people into groups, I think we can see a flip side of this dimension. So the groups we're part of convey valuable information about our particular histories, our cherished practices, our irreducible differences that make us who we are, all those rich details about individual and community membership. Our religious traditions, our religious tribes can provide deep anchors. They give us a sense of connection and belonging. That's a healthy part of identity formation. So, and tribalism is not by definition divisive. And sometimes, in fact, I think, as we've heard examples this morning and yesterday, they fuel generous civic mindedness. One example from evangelical Christianity, which is often associated with maybe a more pejorative sense of tribalism, of having a single-minded allegiance to one's own group at the expense of others, have in many cases been on the forefront of, for example, advocating for immigration reform because of this biblically based commitment to welcoming the stranger, not unlike what Rabbi Cosgrove was talking about as well. So looking at the other side of our equation, unity or the common good, these can be deployed also in positive and negative ways. On the positive side, the common good reflects a vision of a nation where we're welcome and invited to bring the best of our abilities, resources, and traditions to the common task of creating a healthy civic life. And likewise, at its best, unity connotes a kind of utopian vision of harmony and cooperation. But if we flip this on its head, unity sometimes comes at the cost of ignoring issues of equity and sweeping questions about power under the rug. And sometimes the common good can sort of be thin cover for what serves the status quo. So as a starting point, I want to reframe our orienting question away from being an either-or dichotomy. I'm sorry to the percentage person who asked what percentage, and more towards a sort of question of the paradox of difference and sameness, which is going to require some nuanced both and kind of thinking. Part 2, constructing the we, constructing the other. So when we talk about difference and sameness in the context of interfaith relationships, we are inevitably talking about identity, how we see ourselves in relation to others. As a starting point, I think it's helpful to understand something about how these lines get drawn and the implications of these constructions, and even the idea of thinking of them as constructions, not sort of given realities. There's an excellent exploration of this theme in a book called Not God's People, Insiders and Outsiders in the Biblical World. It's written by Lawrence Wills, who was a professor at Episcopal Divinity School near where I teach in Boston. although Episcopal Divinity School has closed, sadly, this past year. He's a wonderful scholar, though. And as Will's title suggests, this practice of constructing insiders and outsiders has been going on for a pretty long time. It's not a new issue. But in his book, one thing I find really helpful is in the introduction, he posits 9 theorems that nuance our understanding of just how these categories get created. And Wills emphasizes in the first 2 theorems, his focus is on the interdependence of the construction of the we and the other. So just as the construction of the we serves to construct the other construction of the other serves to construct the we. And one of the dynamics in this process that he describes is that everything that's valuable, everything that holds society together, everything that we affirm gets constructed as the we. And everything that threatens societal bonds, everything that we dislike or want out gets constructed as part of the other. I sometimes say to my students that you might notice that we all like to be the heroes of our own story, right? No one tells the story of their life and frames themselves as the villain, typically. And I think that's actually operative in this construction of we and other. We are, by definition, our best selves. And in this way, the other becomes a projection of everything we are not or don't want to be. And that can get dangerous when we start believing those constructions to be inherent aspects of who we are and who the other is. In Theorem 3, Wills describes the idea that I love and find very interesting of the proximate other. Now, this is someone who, viewed from an outside third party, seems really similar or even indistinguishable from the we. But in this case, the we magnifies distinctions and imposes a gulf between the we and the proximate other. So at Andover Newton, one example of this is the tensions that were sometimes expressed between our Unitarian Universalist students and our mainline Protestant students. Now, to the students at Hebrew College on our neighboring campus, adjacent campus, every year somebody would be like, what's the difference between a UU and a Christian again? But on the campus, I would have long counseling sessions with students who are like, yes, you are going to hear Christian students say the name Jesus, and yes, it's okay if you don't pray in Jesus' name, and yes, I understand UUs and Christians have very different ideas. But so there was a lot of tension between our students there. But from the outside looking in, they're like, I'm just not getting this. I'm not seeing the difference here. And that's one of the dynamics you'll see over and over again as we try to distinguish in finer and finer ways between we and other. And this proximate other can sometimes be the one with whom we fight most fiercely. One final example from Wills. Theorem 7 talks about ambiguous groups are reassigned as either other or a special case of the adopted we. This one's fascinating to me. Wills calls it an application of the law of the excluded middle. The law of the excluded middle. So everything that's found in between somehow, we and other, needs to be assigned to one of those other 2 extremes. A couple examples of this, I actually see the current national debate around gender identity to be a great example of this. In October, there was a report that the Trump administration was thinking of narrowly defining gender as biological, immutable condition determined at birth. You're male, you're female, period, end of story. So transgender identity breaks that law of the excluded middle. It's like, no, there's nothing in between. We already told you, there's male, there's female. So I think that's one example, and I think part of that understanding the dynamics of the pushback have this dynamic of constructing that doesn't allow a middle is a helpful one for understanding that. Closer to home, kind of a funny, sad story. I have a neighbor when we first moved into our home in Cambridge, and I was introducing her to my brother John. And my brother John is biracial and adopted, and Mrs. Kelly, older Irish Catholic, salt of the earth kind of lovely woman, was very polite and said hi to my brother. And then John left, and she took me aside and she said, "Jenny, your brother really should stay out of the sun. He is getting very dark." And because I was white and John was my brother, he had to be white too. And so Mrs. Kelly needed to find an explanation for his actual skin color. So that's like how hard we are working sometimes to keep these structures in place, these constructions in place. So I'm not going to go through all of Will's theorems. I recommend his book to you. But I've introduced him here because this is an important foundation for where I want to go next. Thinking about how the categories of we and other are constructed is really what inspired me to think about the various ways people respond to the perceived similarities and differences that these constructions set up. So this leads me to part 3 of my talk, a typology of reactions to difference and sameness. So this is new work, and it's probably where I'm most interested to hear from Elliot and Ibu what resonates and what doesn't, and I'm very much still thinking through this material, so if you don't like anything, I'll change it, let's just say that. But I see it as both a helpful tool for personal self-reflection and a kind of analytical tool for understanding various reactions exhibited by individuals and groups when confronted by the reality of differences and sameness. And I describe these as 5 postures, and I use that word posture very intentionally. These are things that we move into and move out of. These are positions we hold and release. So the first posture is difference as threatening. Difference as threatening. In this posture, the we is seen as superior to the other is seen as a direct threat to the we, and any similarities between we and other are either ignored, downplayed, or just rejected. Now there's a biological and evolutionary reason that things that are new or unfamiliar or different might be perceived as threatening. And I think it's a posture, if we're honest, that we've all experienced in moments, in various times and places. And I think particularly in childhood, our experiences and the reactions of the trusted adults around us to things that are new or different have a lot to do with when and how often and how long we hold this particular posture. Translated into political terms, I would describe this posture as underlying things like extreme nationalism and something I might call patriotism plus xenophobia. It's a dangerous combination. And in religious terms, it's really expressed in the idea that my version of my religion, and we were talking about this earlier, is the only true one, and all other belief systems are not only false, but threatening to me. Now, typically, especially in the case of the students I work with, those who adopt this posture have had little or no positive engagement with people outside of their own, in this case, religious groups. And I think that point is important to underline as we think about interventions or ways that we might help ourselves and others move out of this particular posture. Exposure and relationship building and connection to people outside of groups we're familiar with helps to mitigate this posture of difference as threatening. But to give you just one example from my classroom, I had a student who grew up in a very homogenous Christian community, and when I asked her as part of a class assignment to share a story of a significant interreligious encounter, and I meant this both in terms of human relationships or books or movies, or, I really tried to cast a broad net. The only example she could come up with was 9/11. And she said, quote, this was the moment when, quote, I became aware for the first time of a strange and foreign religion called Islam. I wrote down her words because I was so startled, frankly, that early 30s American citizen who was coming to seminary to train as a Christian religious leader would have had that be her experience leading up to that moment. Her early formative experiences provided neither the spaces nor the language to engage with people from religious backgrounds other than her own, so her only association with Islam was as something very threatening. Now, the good news is she was open to learning, and by the end of the class, her posture had shifted significantly, but I think it was really important to understand where and why, and she was coming from holding this posture. Number 2, so difference as threatening. Number 2 is sameness as disconcerting. sameness as disconcerting. Now, in this posture, religious differences are accepted as inevitable and are generally seen as non-threatening, but similarities may come as a surprise, and not necessarily a welcome surprise. I'll give you an example from the book I co-edited, My Neighbor's Faith. It's a story written by a colleague, a Muslim colleague, where she describes the disorientation she felt when she saw monks in a monastery in Romania prostrating in prayer. As Homera writes, quote, prostration, or resting on palms and knees and placing the forehead on the ground, is the quintessential Islamic act of worship. And she continued, to see my own, and she puts it in quotes, my own form of worship performed in an unfamiliar setting unsettled me. It's a great example of similarity as disconcerting. Now, as a reflective practitioner and scholar of Islam with a commitment to interfaith relationships, Homera examines her initial reaction and comes away with a deeper understanding of her own practice. She writes, I understood the power of prostration more deeply in that moment than I ever had. Prostration was I understood the power of prostration more deeply in that moment than I ever had. Before this experience, prostration was mine, and possession had dulled its sharp edge. I like that. Possession had dulled its sharp edge. Now, watching this act as if for the first time, I was struck by the submersion of self that conscious prostration demands of anyone, who enacts it. So you see how she did that? She sort of saw what her practice was in there, and then she saw what this posture was doing. Homera used her experience of sameness as disconcerting as an opportunity for learning. And that's an overarching point I would make about each of these postures that's very important. They are not fixed qualities that define a person. They are postures that we're all capable of embodying and that we can move into and out of. And there's potential for learning and transformation in each of them. There's an opportunity. So each posture has a blind spot, and each posture offers an opportunity, particularly if we catch ourselves in the moment and reflect on our reactions to a given encounter. So that's where the tool of self-reflection comes in. If you're in a situation and you're like, this feels threatening. Okay, let's examine that. What am I reacting to, and what does that come out of? So number 3, sameness as assumed. Sameness as assumed. This posture is characterized by the assertion that we are really the same, and why spend our time arguing about differences that don't matter in the end? The assumption here is that sameness is the best path to unity, and the strength of this posture is the value placed on what connects us. But this can feel like a generous posture, and often does, especially to the we. But it can feel like a form of assimilation or even potentially annihilation to the other if there is only we. And of course, power factors in here. Who is the one asserting sameness? What if those listening don't agree with this speaker about how same they are? And sometimes how we are the same ends up being how you are like me, right? So this posture can, in fact, counterintuitively sometimes involve a sort of unspoken fear of difference that gets us a little back towards that difference as threatening. Difference can kind of be equated with disunity or division or disruption. So that I find kind of fascinating in this posture. One example of this that comes from a class, I co-taught a year-long course on Jewish-Christian relations with a rabbi colleague of mine. And we had a Unitarian Universalist student in the room who started the semester with this kind of sameness as assumed posture. And he was really resistant to focusing on historical and theological differences between Jews and Christians. But by the end of the semester, he wrote a reflection that really marked a change and a shift in his posture. He noted that his default was to this idea of sameness, but then he wrote, what I had yet to realize was that there was even more need to understand and appreciate each other's differences. Not everything is a commonality, and that's perfectly okay. In fact, it's necessary. In our difference lies our dimensionality, our depth, our richness. So his reflection also signals a shift from this third posture of sameness as assumed to the fourth posture I want to discuss, difference as essential. Difference as essential. In this posture, difference is not seen as a threat to unity, but rather what gives community its complexity and texture. Irreducible differences are seen as something to safeguard. Religious differences are seen as something to celebrate. There are parallels here, I think, to the multicultural movement. I can be Christian, you can be Jewish, you can be Muslim, you can be secular humanist, you can be whatever you want without that taking away from any of us. And in fact, in this posture, the more diversity, the better. And there's a lot of power to this posture. However, its challenge or blind spot, as each posture reveals and obscures something, is that similarities may be resisted or downplayed, overlooked or even just rejected. And there's a second danger of oversimplifying or essentializing, and that's why I'm calling this difference as essential, a danger of essentializing particular identities as if there is a singular standard way to be a member of one's particular group, to be a Jew, to be a Christian, to be a woman, to be any of those categories. And I think as one of the speakers, one of the questioners this morning mentioned the word intersectionality, that's been a really helpful set of ideas to help counteract this notion of a single essentialized identity. So that's number 4. Number 5, the last posture I want to talk about, is something I'm calling embracing the paradox of difference and sameness. Embracing the paradox of difference and sameness. This posture asserts a fundamental kinship that comes from acknowledging our shared humanity while embracing both our irreducible differences and our undeniable similarities. So I'm going to say that one again, because this is the one where I think we need to try to live from a little more often. This posture asserts a fundamental kinship that comes from acknowledging our shared humanity while embracing both our irreducible differences and our undeniable similarities. So this posture is embodied when, like, I have a former student who's a African-American imam, and he calls me sister. And every time he does that, I feel this. And I have a friend who I went over and I cooked matzo brie with her, and she posts our picture on Facebook, and I sort of feel this. I felt this at the Interfaith rally on Boston Common in the wake of the shootings at Tree of Life Synagogue. And at that gathering, Sheikh Yasser, the imam of the ISBCC, the large mosque in Roxbury, spoke at the rally very powerfully, and he said this. He said, "I want to say something to the Jewish community. As a Muslim," and he emphasized the word, "I love you. As a Muslim, my back is your back. As a Muslim, my shoulder is your shoulder. As a Muslim, my chest is your chest. We have to drown out the propaganda." And he was just like, and the energy that created, that he was offering this model of both and, of the differences and similarities and the paradox and power of that, being able to hold that. It's a posture that we've probably all experienced at points, and that I believe we are called to inhabit, to live into. And I imagine only someone like the Dalai Lama and the handful of other folks who seem to be able to walk through the world this way are able to hold this posture most of the time. And I think many of the folks we look to as religious role models in particular, I think are able to hold this quality. So the question becomes, how do we increase our capacity to live from this place of paradox? A rabbi friend of mine said that she believes that as she moves closer to paradox, she moves closer to God. And I just love that. And it very much resonates with my understanding of God. And it's actually why I often talk about interreligious engagement as a way of being Christian, and being Christian as obliging me to engage in interreligious work. And why some people find it odd that I teach Christian spirituality and interfaith studies, and why for me, I don't think I could teach one without the other. So in my remaining time, I want to dive in a little bit more deeply to some of the resources from my own tradition. And this part is called, this part 4, the call to love as we have been loved. And it's predicated on this idea that the deeper I go into my own faith journey, the greater my capacity to hold this posture of embracing difference and sameness. And that the opposite is also true. If I neglect my spiritual practice, I can more quickly get stuck in one of the other postures in ways that leave me a little more rigid and a little less flexible. So I was speaking to a small group that largely fell into the similarities as assumed category, I would say. And I was talking about the importance of connecting across lines of differences without this requiring us to diminish or wipe out those differences. And I was trying to make the point more personal, so I said, how many of you have stopped trying to convert your spouses, family members, or friends to thinking exactly like you think without that lessening your love for them? And lots of people were sort of nodding and smiling, and one guy was like really nodding. I was like, you look like you have something to share. And he described himself as an evangelical Christian, and he told us that he had been surprised to discover as a college freshman that his roommate was a devout Muslim. And he was a little apprehensive. But over the course of the year, they developed a profound friendship. And he said, we are still friends today, 20, 30 years later. And then he said, we disagree on just about everything that is important to us. And he sort of paused, and then he thought, and he goes, but I love him. And that, to me, that twin sentiment is so powerful. And I think one of the gifts of this ability to see the paradox of sameness and difference is this recognition of kinship and connection and love. And it reminds me of something, one of my favorite phrases that I quoted last night that Mother Teresa said of, if we have no peace, it's because we've forgotten that we belong to one another. And I find that a very powerful way to express this idea as well. And I want to hone in a little on the word love. I know Christians always talk about love. My Jewish colleagues the rabbi I work closest with, Rabbi Or Rose, one day said to me, he's like, what is it with you Christians and love? I mean, there's a lot of other qualities out there. And yes, absolutely, but it's certainly such a central disposition that fosters a whole host of other dispositions that are essential for a healthy community: humility, curiosity, forgiveness, hope, to name a few. And for me, as a Christian, the imperative to love is the central commandment of my faith. I was struck by Ibu's notion of being grateful, the command to be grateful, the command to love. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, your soul, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Variations of this great commandment appear in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And what struck me and what I became really interested in is that in John, it reads a little differently. He says, just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. And the dependent clause in John's phrasing is just as I have loved you, which kind of makes the case that the command to love one another is dependent on, rooted in, Jesus' love for his disciples, God's love for the people. And this strikes me as essential. And while the commandment is clear, it doesn't mean that it's easy. And perhaps one of the reasons we talk about it a lot is because we have a lot of work to do to fully live into this. And I think that's an important confession, frankly, as Christians, to say that we have not always lived up to this central command. I recently saw a film about James Baldwin's life, which if you haven't seen it, it's on Amazon Prime. Watch it tonight. It's called I Am Not Your Negro. It is incredibly powerful and oddly timely. And one of the lines that lingers with me, and there were many, many from that film that linger with me, was Baldwin's comment, quote, I was not a member of any Christian congregation because I knew they had heard but not lived by the commandment, love one another as I love you. It's a sobering indictment. So if we are going to try to live up to this commandment, one important question is how we understand God's love, right? Scripture tells us love is patient, love is kind, love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude in Corinthians. And the parable of the Good Samaritan gives us this wonderful model of love as just action. James Cohen has a great quote about this. He says, quote, "Love in society is named justice." Love in society is named justice. And Jesus also tells us to love our enemies. You should watch some pastors trying to preach when the lectionary includes this passage, and they're trying to sort of explain what this love thy enemy means. We're working on it. But I think it's a really important addition if we're to rightly understand the kind of love we're called to embody. So what does it look like in practice to love our enemies? One example that really strikes me is from an organization called Homeboy Industries in LA that some of you may have heard of, where they put former rival gang members, former enemies, to work side by side because, as their founder, this Jesuit Father Gregory Boyle puts it, human beings can't demonize people they know. It's just hard to sustain that, which I love. And in the same interview, he says, quote, "If you presume that God is compassionate, loving kindness, all we're asked to do is to be in the world who God is," right? You're always trying to imitate the kind of God you believe in. So if I, as a Christian, hope to follow the command to love as I have been loved, I have to start with my image of God and how narrow or wide I imagine God's love to be. And my experience and understanding of God's love is that there are no limits to who qualifies. By virtue of our humanity, the one who created us loves us. God's love is the definition of unconditional love. This is a tall order. To love as I have been loved is an ideal that I'm called to continually reach towards, knowing that it will always be just out of my reach. God's love will always be wider. And yet, if this is the call, then the question is, where do we start? And perhaps we start by asking who we see as the enemy. Who is other to your we? Now, even in interfaith circles, we draw the lines around insiders and outsiders, right? I was at a conference in 2009, where Ibu was also. We hang out at a lot of the same events, where speakers were talking about the power of a great alliance across religious lines to address issues of poverty and environment and bigotry, and religion could be a force for healing and hope. It was definitely religion as uniting. And we were all in it together, and we avoided polarizing language. The one exception to this inclusive atmosphere was the fundamentalists. Fundamentalists seemed to be the remaining category that we were willing to cast as the other in this great story of religious cooperation. We'd say things like, unlike the fundamentalists, we believe, and we're fighting the intolerance of the fundamentalists and taking back our religion from the fundamentalists. And to be honest, at the time, I barely registered the language. I accepted the fundamentalists as stand-in for narrow-mindedness, intolerance, everything the interreligious movement was not. But then, a young man stood up, and he couldn't have been more than 17 or 18 years old, and he says, "Hi, I'm a fundamentalist." And then he says, "My question is, how do I get more people from my community to come to interfaith gatherings like this?" With no trace of anger or defensiveness, he stood up, identified himself as the enemy among us, and by his presence and his words dismantled all the easy assumptions and caricatures we had been collectively constructing about the fundamentalists, the great other. So whenever I am tempted to lump people into undifferentiated groups and blame them for all of our problems, this story is a really helpful cautionary tale for me. Now, another resource that I turn to when I'm tempted is Paul's letter to the Ephesians. And I am not always a person who turns to Paul. I'm just going to say he's one I wrestle with. But he writes in this passage, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and against powers." Principalities and powers, not people. Ideologies, not individuals. I think that is crucial. It's not that we don't hold people accountable for ideologies they hold, or for ideologies that take them over, sort of possess them in a sense. It's just that we fight principalities and powers, not people. And there's many of those out there to wrestle with: anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism, white supremacy. We can name them. And I think we are called to resist and reject. It's not a call to be passive in the face of any of those. It's just that the key is to remember that these are all forms of hatred we are susceptible to. They are not inherent in an individual or group of people. We have to resist that temptation to demonize people, even or maybe especially those we call our enemies. So to come full circle, I'll return to the question we began with. Do our identities divide us or unite us? Now I'm going to give you the percentages. No. In the wake of the discussion, we might first ask about the us or the we that is posing this question. Divide or unite us? Then we would emphasize that both division and unity have their roles to play in healthy civic life. Using the typology of reactions to sameness and difference, we might analyze the various lessons of each posture. And then I would encourage us and you and myself to root down into our respective religious traditions and ethical systems and draw out those resources that allow us to live in this place where we can embrace the paradox of sameness and difference, where our shared kinship is what we see in one another, and it doesn't require us to forego or wipe out or ignore either those beautiful, irreducible differences or those wonderful, undeniable similarities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Another challenging issue before us, and I'm anxious to hear now what Eboo Patel and then Elliot Cosgrove how they will respond. And also anxious to hear your questions as we continue this second session. So Eboo, you want to begin our responses?
Okay. I know how I begin everything, at least today, which is dang, you're smart. Thank you for that, Jenny. The fun thing is being friends with Jenny for 20 years, right? Like the beginning of my interfaith journey, part of the co-founding the idea of IFYC and our thought developing alongside each other. So what a joy to do that.
Likewise.
So one of the themes, the type of difference that we are principally talking about here is religious difference. So one of the questions that I want to raise, especially coming out of your talk, is there something particularly challenging about religious difference as opposed to race, gender, culture, nation? I think all of them have distinctive challenges. What is distinctively challenging about religious difference? A couple of interesting ways to frame this. One is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the great philosopher, once said, it is impossible to live with the person who you know is damned. Okay. Michael Walzer, the great American philosopher, writes a book called What It Means to Be an American, in which he says, from the time of the Greeks, political philosophers believed that in order to have a democracy, you needed to have religious homogeneity. That people were a peoplehood was made up of a religious communion, and that peoplehood would become a nation or a state. Okay, and then he ends that section and he begins the next one with the line, until the United States of America. So what I think is striking about that is this notion that, first of all, I think it's a part of the American experiment we all ought to rightfully be proud of, by which I mean not satisfied with, but recognize as an inheritance, which is a responsibility to nurture, and recognize that it's sui generis. It's first of its kind in human history at a mass level, which is the idea that you could have a religiously diverse democracy, right? A place in which people who believed in one fullness of the truth would live with as citizens other people who believed in a different fullness of truth. What is particularly hard about a religiously diverse democracy? So let's define our terms here. Democracy is not just a place where people elect representatives, it's a place where people get to make personal convictions public, right? Any one of us can stand out in the street corner and hand out leaflets or shout from the top of our lungs a particularly faith-based political position. And there's a variety of them that we all know about. And any other of us could stand on the opposite street corner and shout the opposite thing. And we are all free to do that, right? The definition of a democracy is a place where we can make personal convictions public. Part of the definition of a dictator, part of what dictators do is they squelch civic life. They do not allow personal convictions to become public. What's the definition of diversity? It's not just the differences you like. And one of the things I love about Jenny's typology is it frames that for us. There's a little bit of a curmudgeon in me, which comes out around my kids' elementary school sometimes, where there's like all these posters that say celebrate diversity and multiculturalism is our strength, et cetera, et cetera. I mostly believe that, right? But every once in a while, the curmudgeon in me is like, what about the differences you don't like, right? What about the disagreements? That's what I think the most interesting, if challenging, part of diversity is. What happens when a Jain looks at a Muslim and says, your Eid celebration, your slaughtering of goats, which you believe is sacred because it is a commemoration of God replacing Ishmael on the rock with a ram, we view that as a violation of what is most deeply sacred. And they do. Jains view even potatoes and onions and carrots as alive. And the taking of any life is a violation of God's will and the sacred. Of course, many Hindus and Buddhists would view the taking of animal life in the same way. So, what Muslims do as a sacred and solemn ritual, people from other religions who also have a definition of the sacred view that as a violation. How do you have a society of Jains and Muslims? The fact that we do is remarkable. Diverse democracy. The religion part of it, right? Religion, per Paul Tillich, the great theologian, is about ultimate concerns. So if democracy is about the ability to make personal convictions public, diversity is not just the differences you like. Religious diversity is having personal convictions around ultimate concerns that the person next to you doesn't like or views as a violation. Is it any wonder that people thought that you couldn't have this together, right? You couldn't have a democracy of Jains who are advancing a sacred idea of vegetarianism or vegan, or actually a sacred idea of the not even uprooting of carrots, and Muslims who are proudly saying this is the sacred way in which we celebrate Eid. How could you have that, right? So what I want to offer is perhaps a close cousin to your fifth posture, which is the paradox of similarity and difference, right? Which is the only way to have a healthy, religiously diverse democracy is to recognize that we are going to disagree on some fundamental things and still work together on other fundamental things, right? So it is to say that Trump voters and Hillary voters, if they are both heart surgeons and they are scheduled for a two-person life-saving heart surgery tomorrow at the local hospital, bracket their disagreement on American electoral politics, which is a fundamental thing, and agree to cooperate together on that heart surgery. I put that example to students on campuses a lot, right? Students who, out of passion and zeal, might say, I'm not working with that student group because I disagree with them on this fundamental thing. I am not questioning the disagreement. I'm asking, what else will that cancel? Right? What else will that cancel? And nobody I have met yet says you should not do the heart surgery. But I want to start moving down the line, right? So would you leave? Should I take my son out of a basketball league with the founder of the league who retweets the tweets of a president who I vehemently disagree with? Should I take him out of that basketball league? It's not a life-saving heart surgery. It's an elective basketball league. But should I take him out of that? Would I not serve on the PTA with somebody with whom I have a fundamental disagreement? Would I not be a chaperone on a school field trip? The reason I bring these things up is because these are the questions, I think, that are both the foundation and parameters of a healthy, religiously diverse democracy. So I'm going to end with a couple more insights from political philosophers and then turn it over to Elliot. So one of my favorite insights on this, when it comes to sameness and difference, is Daniel Allen, who's university professor at Harvard and wrote a fantastic book called Talking to Strangers, in which he says, "E pluribus unum" in the American canon as our motto is actually just a little bit off. It's not oneness that we're going for; it's wholeness, right? And what wholeness is able to do is to absorb difference and build it into a cohesive whole. There's a whole lot of ways to absorb difference and make it either assimilate it, totally melt it away, or to have it chaos or civil war, right? Wholeness is a sense that there are a variety of parts and they're able to come together in a positive way. It's Eliot's symphony. It's the example of a potluck that I gave yesterday. John Courtney Murray, the great Jesuit philosopher in the middle of the 20th century, adds some texture to this. He says, let us remember that the very definition of the term civilization is living together. The definition of the term conversation is talking together, and what the barbarian does is destroys the conversation. A democratic society is a society in which people who form a civilization choose to live together. How do they do that? It is the manner in which they talk together. How does that get destroyed? We call that barbarism, right? People who destroy the conversation, those are the barbarians. What does it mean to live together? So John Courtney Murray points out two quick things, and I'll leave you with these. One is he asked the question, how much difference and what kind can a cohesive society handle? How much unity and of what kind does a cohesive society require, right? What kind of differences and what kind of unity? And he finally says, the definition of a diverse democracy is a society that can hold together the divergent views of diverse groups. Underlying that is a strong political community that we all give our loyalty to and we all seek to build up. We can never forget that the ability to hold together diverse groups with divergent views requires a strong underlying political community, right? A set of fundamentals that we agree on, strengthen, and agree to hold up.
Thank you, Ibu. And one of the great pleasures is joining this group of three and knowing the relationship, the friendship you and Jennifer have had over the last 20 years. And so when you turn to Jennifer and you say, dang, you're smart, you do it 20 years in. I've known you for 20 minutes, and dang, you're smart. So for your passion, for your wisdom, and really for creating a pickle for me, because I'm at a loss of, it's like a beautiful painting, and do I really want to, say anything one way or the other? And then after Ibu, and I'm saying, well, all right, what do I do? So we either preach or we pray when at a loss. So I want to throw a curveball. And I want to respond to you. I wrote it. I promise. I wrote like each of the 4 categories, and I was like, I have this to say, this to say. I'm throwing it out. I want to talk about the scriptural reading that Jews around the world were reading this past week, which is a story of the birth of Jacob and Esau. In Hebrew, the parsha is Toldot, the Torah reading is Toldot, and it's a moment where after many years of barrenness, Rebecca, the matriarch, feels the 2 boys, well, she doesn't know they're boys, but she feels the strugglings and the wrestlings within her womb, that there's a battle going on, and she goes and cries out to God. And the words in the Hebrew are Lama ze anochi, which, if you have a bit of Hebrew, grammatically you know is a very odd phraseology. It's almost this groan, this visceral response, which translates sort of, but not exactly, as why am I, or why has this befallen me, or why do I exist? A great biblical scholar, Aviva Zornberg, calls it a 3-word riddle. We don't actually know what those 3 words, lama ze anochi, but it's somehow the plight of her existential condition, which may be just a response to her pain, but it may be that she's trying to understand how she can go from this perpetually barren state into a position now of coping with the anticipated arrival of twins. No one knows exactly what it means, but she says these words, why has this, lama ze anochi, why has this happened to me? And the rabbis explain that at that moment where she cries out, she asks to understand her condition relative to the rest of the world, because she understands there to be an unfairness, that this has befallen her and not others. And she feels at that moment very alone and isolated in her condition. And this isolation, and we know the verse from the very beginning of Genesis, it's not good for a human being to be alone, prompts her to do something that the biblicists among us know in the